This morning we start a brand new series that will take us through to the end of November. We'll be unpacking the Gospel of John. And as we've done in the past with other series, we make some books available in the bookstore for those of you who want to follow along at home. And this time we're putting out a set by N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is probably the greatest living New Testament scholar we have on the planet right now. And he writes two different kinds of books. Those that are sort of melt your brain, thousands of pages, read a paragraph, stop, catch a breath. And then he writes books for the rest of us. And we got a copy of them right here. It's called John for Everybody. If you're looking for something just to track with the messages or to be part of your own personal reading or for your small group, I would strongly suggest it. They're in the bookstore. Great resources and an excellent price. They're back there. Check them out. So as we begin here this morning, and we begin to unpack with what is probably one of the greatest books in the entire Bible, I want to start off by asking you a question. So if I say to you the words Tim Hortons, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Coffee. I heard bad coffee. I will accept that answer. That's good. We can go with brown water. Any of those things would be okay, right? Because for us as Canadians, in one way or another, whether it's through marketing or whatnot, Tim Hortons has worked its way, baked its way into our subconscious. It's our Canadian coffee, right? There's one on every corner. And we've all had some of their drink. We've all had some of their donuts. You know what it smells like. You know what your clothes smell like when you walk out of there. It's a meeting spot. It's a place to hang out. Everywhere you go, you understand and know that in Canada, more than likely, there will be a Tim Hortons. It's part of our subconscious, part of our psyche. There was no test. No one forced you to know this. It's just there. Let's try it again. So if I ask you the question, what is Canada's game, you would say, hockey is Canada's game, of course. Of course hockey is Canada's game. And it doesn't matter if you have played or you have watched other people's play, whether you played road hockey, whether you signed your kids up, it doesn't matter. Canadians are synonymous with hockey. It's in our blood, again, baked into our psyche. For those of you who are maybe on the old-timer side of things, how many of you remember the 1972 Summit Series against the Russians, right? You made it this far. Good job, guys. You did it. Way to go. I've seen the tapes. Paul Henderson scores the big goal. It was a rough and tumble series, and that put us on the map as the greatest hockey players in the world. Now, if we fast forward, for those of you who are in my generation, the image that comes to mind right away is the 1987 Canada Cup against the Russians. How many remember that, right? Copps Coliseum. It's a 3-on-1 break. There's a minute and a half left in the game. 5-5 Canada and Russia. And Gretzky, as he always did, would just glide up the left-hand boards. He sees Lemieux coming in his rear view. He passes back. Lemieux takes it, drops it top shelf upstairs where they keep the peanut butter. And the Russian goalie has no chance. And the Canadians win. We remember that. I remember where I was. And for those of you who are a little bit younger, there's another era of great hockey players and moments, whether it be Stanley Cup or the Olympics or whatnot, where we say, when you say hockey, there is a flood of emotions and feelings and images and stories and tastes and smells that all come to your mind. Just because I said, what is hockey? In the same way, the writer of the Gospel of John is taking words that are loaded with meaning, and he inserts them in these opening verses of this book to say something. But not only that, he wants a flood of memories and hopes and tastes and feelings to come into people's minds, not only for his first readers, but also for us. So let's kick things off this morning. John chapter 1, verse 1, reading from the Message version this morning, it says this: the Word was first. The Word present to God, God present to the Word. The Word was God, in readiness for God from day one. And everything was created through him. Nothing. Not one thing came into existence, into being without him. What came into existence was life, and the life was the light to live by. The life light blazed out of the darkness, and the darkness couldn't put it out. There once was a man, his name was John, sent by God to point out the way to the life light. He came to show everyone where to look and who to believe in. And John was not himself the light. He was there to show the way to the light. And the life light was the real thing. Every person entering life, he brings into light. He was in the world was there through him, and yet the world didn't even notice. He came to his own people, but they didn't want him. But whoever did want him, who believed he was who he claimed and would do what he said, he made to be their true selves. their child of God selves. These are the God-begotten, not blood-begotten, not flesh-begotten, not sex-begotten. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. John has laced these opening verses. They're almost hymn-like. There's a beauty in the way they roll off the tongue. He has laced it with words that are pregnant with meaning. He didn't just pick and choose. He was very particular and intentional with what he wanted to say and what he wants us to know and think about this Jesus. And like when we use words like Tim Hortons or hockey, these words contain more than what appears to be there just at face value. For starters, John's first audience, they are a rejected people. They're in the middle of two worlds and they belong to no one. They're outcasts with their own Hebrew folk because they've decided to take this different path and follow this Jesus. And the majority of their countrymen and countrywomen would say, I don't know what you're doing. This makes things awkward. We need to make some space between you and I. But also remember that these folk are living in occupied territory. So Rome is in charge. And Rome has its own set of rules and regulations and deities and the way that life works. And these Jews are now even more problematic than those other people because they're saying really strange things like they're eating the body and drinking the blood of their Savior. Are these cannibals? Who are these people? So now all of a sudden you've got these Jesus followers, followers of the way that are caught between two worlds. They're not Romans and they're not Hebrews like their countrymen. So they are this rejected people and John is writing to them. So because they are in this awkward place, in a way John has to disguise his terms a little bit, sort of fly under the radar, write things in between the lines, because the words and the terms and the ideas that he is communicating are dangerous. They are political and religious terms that could get these people in a lot of hot water. So he chooses and picks them carefully to sort of conceal them. And as the book begins to unfold, we'll also see how he co-opts some of Rome's terms. He takes their ideas and stories and analogies, and he says, you know what? You think the world is that way, but let me just turn them just slightly and let you know who really is God and how this world is actually run and who this actually all belongs to. Because you see, for Rome, there's a series of deities. There's a series of emperors who claim to be sons of God. So what John is doing, even in these opening verses, is giving his first readers the tools to sort all these things out, to sort out the deities and figure out what's real and what's not. And John is doing the very best that he can to describe who Jesus is with the words and the metaphors that he has at his disposal, pretty much like any of us. We've only got a certain few things to work with, so let's work with them. Let's unpack a few here this morning. John opens this book by using this word beginning. Here we saw it as the first, and this is a loaded term to start your book with. Because if you were a Hebrew and someone is writing to you and they use the term in the beginning, where's that tying back to? Genesis, that's right. So if you have followed God this whole way and you remember those opening lines from Genesis, John is trying to make a connection here that this God that we knew and remember from way back in the beginning, who has always been there, oh, he's here with us now in this man, Jesus. But not only that, John is also speaking against how some of Rome lays out their own deities. Because you see, there was a sort of one-upmanship between the emperors especially, because they all believed themselves to be sons of God. And those who came earlier were more important than those who came later. So they would often say things like, I was before this guy, or I actually came first, because their power and authority were directly connected to their sequence when they showed up. So when John says about Jesus that in the beginning Jesus was there, in fact, he created things. In fact, he was actually there before the beginning. What he's doing is using that same ideology, the same images, the same things that are baked into that culture and how they understand their God, and saying, before any of those cats, oh, there was Jesus. And yes, those people were born on this earth. Jesus was born here too, yes, as a man. But guess what? He was actually here before all of that. He actually spun this world into existence. So he's using the terms and the ideas that are already part of the culture and using them to his advantage as he tries to explain who this Jesus is. And he drops another heavy one, and he uses the word, capital W. And in Greek thought and understanding, this word is this sort of presence. This is this essence, this brain power, this thinking that sort of holds all of the cosmos together. And in Greek philosophy, this was a widely accepted term. The universe is structured based on this word, and this word can also be translated as wisdom, capital W. So John takes this word, takes this understanding, slides it in and says, guess what? All that you think and already know about whatever the force or presence is that keeps the universe together, it's actually all taking place. It is personified wisdom in this man, Jesus. This is God actually manifesting himself, being active in our world. You can see, feel, and you can touch him. So this is what he is saying to those who are Greek thinkers, who think along those lines. But back to his Hebrews brothers and sisters, when John uses the word like word, capital W, he's also identifying Jesus as the embodiment of all the scriptures have to say about who God is. And remember, these are folks that are doing their very best to keep in line with the Torah, because the Torah describes who God is, and their life is patterned after it. Now, John is adding something to the end by saying this. Listen, that God from way back in the beginning, that Torah you're trying to honor, Jesus is the fulfillment of that. It's the one and the same person. So the Word, capital W, the real thing, God's expression of himself, wisdom personified, has shown up on the scene. Then he starts to play with some other terms. He says things like light and dark. And these are Old Testament images for good and for evil. But now John is taking it and turning it just slightly and saying that this light, capital L, is not only something, but it's someone. And it's by this someone that we are able to see the rest of the world more clearly. And the darkness, that darkness does not comprehend it. Your Bible might say the darkness cannot overtake it. The darkness can't overcome it. The darkness might not be able to master it. But the root word behind any of those terms is this word grasp. The darkness could not grasp it. And if you remember from our Genesis study about a year ago, this is the word we heard way back in the beginning when the writer described Eve reaching out for that fruit. She's reaching out. She is grasping, literally for a fruit, but really behind the scenes, she's grasping for something that is outside of herself. She is overstepping her boundaries. She's trying to take some sort of power that is not hers. And then for those of you who remember our study in Philippians, Paul uses the same word in Philippians chapter 2 when he describes Jesus and says that he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. God isn't someone to be usurped or taken over. I'm not overstepping my boundaries here. So John, again, is taking that understanding that's already part of their vocabulary, already there, and he's saying that the light, capital L, is here. You can see the world by it. And the darkness, even though it's trying to grasp, even though it's trying to put the light out, cannot happen. And then finally, he says this light is also the life, capital L. Remember, for the Hebrews here, when they think of God, they think of something very, very spatial. That if God's going to show up and do something, it'll be cosmic, it'll be fireworks, it'll be out there. It's sort of out of our reach. But then when Jesus shows up, as the life, John describes it, he's not so much out there in the galaxy. He's right here, right now. There is an earthiness to him. And that speaks, again, to the Greek line of thought. Because if you were a good Greek-type philosopher and understood the world around you, your spirit, your soul, is the only part of you that is worth keeping. It's the only thing that is clean. It's the only thing that's actually worth anything. So what you're trying to do is separate yourself from this mortal coil. Because your body is dirty, it is gross, it is broken, and you don't want any part of that. So when John says that Jesus is the life, not out in the stars life, but this down-to-earth, flesh and blood life, he's not only speaking something to his Hebrew brothers and sisters, he's also speaking something to those who have adopted this Greek thought of how we have to separate the spirit from the body. He's saying, Jesus says, no, there's not a separation. There's a togetherness right here. There is something about keeping these things together. So Jesus' place, actions, teaching, life, death on earth turns all of that thinking onto its head. And he exemplified that true spirituality isn't about leaving this planet and going to some other galaxy far, far away. True spirituality is about being present in the here and now. And the body isn't something that we discard and throw away. Is it broken? Yes, but still holy. And you know what? Absolutely redeemable. So John is using these loaded terms because he wants to get a certain message across. That Jesus as the life, capital L, not only speaks to his authority over everything, over darkness, over death itself, but Jesus as the life, capital L, also speaks to his intentions for this world and his intentions for you and I. It's the story of a God who does not bail on his creation or bail on his planet. This is a God who shows up in the flesh, gets earthy about it. And what he is doing is that he is ushering in this new creation. He's showing us how it's supposed to be done. That's why he came. So John is using the very best terms and metaphors and ideas and tastes and smells to describe this. And really, at the end of the day, that's all any of us have. These are the only tools we have available. Catholic priest Richard Rohr describes it this way. He says, the only language available to religion is metaphor. And that makes total sense. Think about it. We've got these little bits and pieces of how we describe God. We don't really know. And we are hemmed in by language, and sometimes we look at the scriptures and we think, wow, I really wish this was a lot clearer. Man, if God just gave us a spiral-bound instruction booklet, this would be far easier. But the reason John uses images like this is not to clutter or to confuse, but he's trying to put meat on the bones of this understanding of God. And that's actually what Jesus is. He is literally God fleshed out today. So then this opening passage strikes us with a question right off the bat. When we look at ourselves in the world that we find ourselves in, where does the good news of Jesus need to be fleshed out today? Where does the ushering in of God's new creation need to take place today? What are the deities and the objects of worship and the cultural understandings? What are the things that need to be sorted out today? And like John, what are the images and the words and the experiences and the tastes and the flavors that we actually have to work with? So in a sense, for you and I as Christians in 2014, this is a bit of a negotiation process. We negotiate the world together. And when we actually do it together, we form this alternative community that's able to negotiate good and evil, light and dark. And again, as we do it as a whole, when that happens as a group, do you know what that's called? That's called church. When we are doing the same things together, when we are negotiating, mediating heaven and earth, figuring out, sorting out deities, enfleshing the good news of Jesus in the here and now, when a group of people get together to do that, we call it the church. And our old friend Leslie Newbegin defines it beautifully when he says, the church is the bearer to all nations of a gospel that announces the kingdom, the reign, and the sovereignty of God. It calls men and women to repent of their false loyalty to other powers, to become believers in the one true sovereignty, and so to become corporately a sign, instrument, and foretaste of that sovereignty of the one true living God over all nature, all nations, and all human lives. It is not meant to call men and women out of the world into a safe religious enclave, but to call them out in order to send them back in as agents of God's kingship. Right? You picking that up? The church is this embodiment of this story of a God who has always led from the beginning, throughout the ages, continues to lead today, and into the future. And what he's doing is helping us lead us out of this old world, out of this old way of being, this old way of thinking, into this new promised world that we are able to see and act and be different than we were before. And the Apostle Paul is going to pick up on this theme in his letters later on in the New Testament, where he talks about God's kingdom as this moving people out from an old place into a new place. This rescue attempt by God is full of healing and forgiveness, and it's moving people in a particular direction. And when Paul talks about it in that way, he has the exodus of Egypt in mind. He's saying you left one world to go into another. And now what we see in God through Christ, this new exodus also takes place in us because we previously have been slaves to this world, slaves to the old way of being, but through Jesus there is a new exodus outside of that old Egypt, that old way of sinning, into a new way of being. And where is that other world? Is it magical? Is it in a galaxy far, far away? No. What we've learned already is that it's right here and right now. So in these opening stanzas of John, what he's trying to get across to us is this, is that God is up to something. And he is here, and this is his world. And it doesn't matter what Rome says. It doesn't matter what claim Rome has on land and on people. All of that gets trumped. Why? Because Jesus was first from before the beginning. Jesus is the life and the light. He's the one who sets the rules. And when the church comes together to follow in the way of Jesus, to form this alternative community, this kingdom of hope and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and hospitality, these are the signs of the new Exodus. We leave the old way of being and we move towards the new way, the new creation, which in fact is the way things were always supposed to be. So maybe this is why John uses another loaded term in here when talking about Jesus. He says that Jesus moved into the neighborhood. Or perhaps your Bible says he tabernacled amongst us, which again is an allusion, is a tie to this Hebrew history. When the Israelites are wandering through the desert, they got the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence is there, and they set up this makeshift tent of like a temple, and whenever they stop, they set it up, and in that place is where they meet God. Everything comes and goes. Any interaction with God happens under that canopy. But now things are changing. It's AD 70. The physical temple is now gone. So where do these folks go to meet with God? Where do they interact with him? Where do they learn? The temple was the place where you met with God for sacrifices, for atonement, for festivals, for celebrations. But now that's gone. Where do we go? Oh, wait a second. John has an idea. Maybe instead of going to a particular place, we go to a particular person. Because John is constantly implying that Jesus thought and acted as if he was some sort of replacement for the temple. So instead of all our interactions with God happening under a certain roof, they are now taking place in a certain person. And again, this is going to mess up the Greek thinkers, because I don't want to be trapped into a body, the Greek thinkers would say. I want to separate my spirit. Are you sure a God actually physically wants to be here? Jesus says, yes. Let me show you how it's done. I'm going to kick off this new creation. And by the way, like we said before, now you can be who you were supposed to be. Paul calls it us becoming a royal priesthood to mediate heaven and earth, which again is a connection back to Genesis. Because remember when we talked about this, there was this hierarchy, right? And God created all things in the heavens, and then he created all things in the earth, and that thing that met in the middle was what? Us, humans, priests, in between heaven and earth. And now we can resume that role. And when we do that, when we become who we are meant to be, John says, then finally we become our true selves. Or your Bible might say, finally we become children of God. Parker Palmer explains it this way. He says, the true self is not the ego self that wants to inflate us or deflate us. It's not the intellectual self that wants to hover over the mess of life. It's not the ethical self that wants to live by some abstract moral code. It is the self planted in us by the God who made us in God's own image. The self that wants nothing more or less than for us to be who we were created to be. Friends, this is the bottom line of humanity. This is the bottom line of Christian life. And this is why John brings the opening of his chapter here to this place when he says, now you can be your true selves. You are the God-begotten, he says. You're not the blood-begotten. What's the blood-begotten? Oh, I'm important, or I have value, or I have worth because of my lineage, that blood that's running through my veins, right? I am somebody because of where I've come from. John says, no. Your identity, not wrapped up in that. Well, what about maybe we are the flesh-begotten? You know, well, I got this physical piece of me here. It can do some things and not do other things, and that defines who I am, whether I'm great or not, whether I'm worthwhile or not. And John says that because of the life, the light, that the darkness cannot overtake, so that you can become your true selves, you are not flesh begotten. Your identity is not wrapped up in your physical makeup. Well, what about the sex begotten, John says? And that's what we'll hear a lot about today. That we are defined by our sexuality or by our preferences or by our inclinations or by our makeup. John says, no, that is not true. You are not defined by your sexuality. Your identity is not wrapped up in who you are not attracted to. John says something different. He says our identity is not wrapped up in ourselves. It's actually wrapped up in God. You want to know who you are? Get to know who God is. And he names God as the name, capital N. And that brings us into an understanding of if we as human beings will submit ourselves, submit our identities, entrust ourselves to God, then and only then do we get a better picture of who we are, who God is, and what our place is in this world. So when we combine the ideas of being our true selves, of being God's kids, of being a royal priesthood, of mediating heaven and earth right here in the present, not far away in some galaxy, but right here, right now, then we finally begin to see the picture that John is painting, and it is this. Listen closely. That Christianity is not a religion. Christianity is not a system or a set of beliefs. Christianity is an announcement that God is real, that he is alive, that he loves us, that he is with us, and alongside of us, he is slowly but surely redeeming this whole world and turning everything back to the way it was always meant to be. And you'll do well to notice that this announcement is something that can only be properly heard and understood in community. Christianity is not a solo journey. I know you think you can do it on your own, but you can't. It doesn't work that way. John is writing to a group of people, not to an individual. And that's why for us as a church, we invest time and resources in something like small groups. Do we do it because we feel like you've got nothing better to do? Like your schedule already isn't jammed full? Or we've got money to burn, so we'll put a person in place and a program in place to clutter up your lives? No. As a value of this church, we say, if we're going to do this God piece right, we need each other. So why wouldn't we organize a few systems in place to ensure that we are doing this life together? I will repeat, you can't be a Christian all by yourself. You can't read and understand the Bible alone. These are things that are fleshed out, must be, have to be, have always been fleshed out in the presence of others. So from this perspective, Christianity, the announcement, is also a way to be witnessed, to be experienced. We are not here to coerce or convince people to accept our brand of Christianity, or at least the ideas that we feel are the most important. The goal of Lakeview Church isn't to fill this room. That's not the end goal and point. The point here isn't to be the best church in the city. The point here isn't to empty out other churches to make sure people hang out and do things with us. That is not the point. The reason why you and I are here together is because we need to do this journey together. We do it because we need to remind ourselves of whose we are, whose image is stamped inside of us. We do this because we recognize that our healing and our forgiveness and our strength and our courage come from people in places like this. But we also do it because as we move together as this alternative community, as the church, what we also become is an invitation for others to wake up to their true selves, their God-begotten selves, their children of God selves. The goal isn't to be a big church. The goal is to be like Jesus, to incarnate his good news for his glory and for the sake of others. So why then do we take this incarnational approach? Why do we put meat on the bones of this good news of Jesus? Because it ushers in the new creation. It continues the work that Jesus has already begun. Why do we take this incarnational approach? Because it helps you and me deal with the culture and the context that we find ourselves in. Why do we take this incarnational approach? Because it helps us redefine and to clarify and to sort out the things that are before us, revealing the true meaning of life in each other. Why do we take this incarnational approach as a unit together, as Christians, as the church? Because what it does is that it trumps all other claims. And it calls out things that are lies, calls out the things that are false, and disqualifies anything that is not true. This is the Jesus that John is presenting. And this is who Jesus is inviting you and me to be. So may we recognize that we live in a world that is pregnant with meaning. Stories, ideas, images, peoples, places. And as Christ followers in the year 2014, part of our role is to be trained negotiators, to sort out the pieces of good and evil and light and dark. And we're able to do this because the light, capital L, gives us a beam, gives us a shot of light to actually see things for what they really are. And when we begin to pick up on that, we begin to follow Jesus right back into the neighborhoods. Because spirituality isn't something that we pull ourselves away from and move out to some spectacular galaxy. No, it's something that manifests itself in the here and now. We are called out to go back in and be leaders of this new exodus, out of the old way of thinking and back into the new way of being, this new creation. And this is a localized response. We can't do it without each other, and we can't do it somewhere else. It happens right here and right now. And when we do this together, then and finally then do we become our true selves. And Christianity becomes this announcement, this witness that takes root not only in us, but also takes root through us.